Hi, and welcome to this session on how land use planning and policy can foster climate resilience at Festival of Place Climate Resilience 2023. I'm Christine Murray. I'm the founding director of the Festival of Place and the developer. Many of the professionals that I invite to speak to at our events come highly recommended, and this session features three highly recommended speakers who I later realized were all Americans who've all worked in the UK as expats, so bringing a little bit of a transatlantic feel to the event today. As a very polite Canadian, I am ceding my chair to the Americans for this session, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Rappaport, who is an urban planner, researcher, and strategist with over 20 years' experience in leading strategic projects on urban and regional planning and governance. Land use and policy in the context of resilience is a critical topic, and it requires that expertise and strategic thinking. And Rappaport was the assistant director of strategy at Homes England and named one of the Planners 2022 Women of Influence. She's on the board of Publica CIC and recently founded Polygon Place Strategy as director. So welcome, emoji applause for Elizabeth.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the lovely emoji applause, which is flooding across my screen. I'm really happy to be here to be chairing the final session in Festival of Place Climate Resilience 2023. We're definitely going to try and take you out with a bang for those of you who've been here for a couple of days. With, as Christine mentioned, a bit of a North American takeover, but it is definitely an Anglo-American group. All of us have had time working both in the US and the UK and in some cases other countries as well on the issues that we're going to talk about today. I am going to keep my introduction short because I've had a lot of chats with our panelists in the run-up to today, and they've got so much to say. I'm so excited for them to share it with you and to have a really good, hopefully engaging conversation between them and with lots of questions afterwards. So I'm going to hand over very quickly to our first speaker, who is Susanna Dart. So Susanna is the Climate Change Policy Officer at Lancaster City Council. She works in the Planning and Climate Change Service, and her work covers the policies, projects, and priorities of the council in addressing climate emergency at both the corporate and district level. And Lancaster is really a leader in the UK in doing this kind of work. Susanna's work is particularly focused on planning policy and holistically integrating climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. If any of you tuned into the Great Climate Fight on Channel 4, you'll have seen some of the work that she and her colleagues are doing featured in that. But I will hand over to her now to tell you more. Welcome, Susanna.
Thank you so much. I'll just share my screen here. And we'll get started. So thank you so much for the introduction and really happy to be here today. As mentioned, I'm Susanna Dart, Climate Change Policy Officer at Lancaster City Council, and I'm based in planning policy. Just to get it out of the way, the first thing people usually say to me when we meet is that's not a local accent. This usually turns into a conversation about the weather because I live in England and why I left sunny, warm, blue sky Arizona to come to the rainy, gray Northwest. I came to Lancaster originally in 2017 to do a MSc in Environment Development at Lancaster University. And so while I might not have come here for the weather, I have definitely stayed here for the climate. I'm one of the three officers in the Climate Hub in planning policy at the City Council. And as Elizabeth mentioned, we work across the council on a range of different things, particularly things like strategic long-term planning and how the council and our partners come work on that together. Before digging in, and just for some context, Lancaster is a non-metropolitan district council in the northwest of England, here on the map. We've got a population of about 142,000. We boast the center of the UK, and we have a diversity of city, coast, and countryside. Now, this is really good. It provides a really diverse amount of landscapes, but it also presents some unique challenges in the face of the climate crisis. We're going to look today at how local plans can help to support climate resilience. So the first question is, what even is a local plan? So just going to cover this for those who might not know. Lancaster's local plan is a vision for the future of the district. It shapes the way that we live, the way that we work, the way that we play, and the way that we travel. Also, critically, it shapes the ways in which we build our houses and where we build them, and it also shapes the way in which we interact with the environment and the things that we do there. Local plans are prepared through a legal process. We gather evidence, consider different policy options. We have rounds of consultation. We have informal and formal engagement. Um, and then we rewrite based on the results of the consultation. And then we have a examination by an independent planning inspector. And finally, these policies are adopted by council. They are used to help decide planning applications, and we inform other planning decisions, and they're like a local guide to what we should and should not build, where we should not be building, particularly important for climate resilience. And it shapes the kind of infrastructure and community investments that we need and that help determine the future pattern of development. They're super important because without them, development still takes place, but it's not necessarily in the right location, and it might not be without the infrastructure that's needed to make sure the place works for people and environment. Before I dig into the climate emergency local plan review, I have to talk about the young people in our district and give them credit. Young people will be the most impacted by the climate crisis and the polycrises that surround that. In our district, like on much of the globe, it's already taking a toll on the youth in our district's mental health, and it's impacting their future decision making today. Driven by the young people in our district, Lancaster City Council declared a climate emergency in 2019. So the climate emergency declaration sparked a climate emergency local plan review, which looked at every single one of our local planning policies through the lens of climate change. We looked particularly at how we can maximize co-benefits as well. So how we can have additional benefits beyond the on the box objective. We looked at everything from blue and green infrastructure, sustainable travel, historic buildings, etc. We're going to focus today, though, on the two biggest policy areas, which is energy use in homes and addressing flood risk. So we need policies to drive our greenhouse gas emissions. For those of you who've not seen this graph or are familiar with it, even today there's a net increase in emissions across all global sectors. The latest IPCC reports and the documents that have been prepared in advance of COP28 really highlight how dangerously behind we are on securing a livable future for all of us. The pink on the grass on this graph are the greenhouse gas emissions and global warming we would have if no policies. And I think what's particularly important for the discussion today is that with current policies in place, we're heading for a 2.5 to 2.9 degree world, the orange on the graph, which is well over the 1.5 degrees of warming of the Paris Agreement. The other important thing to talk about is that the share of emissions associated with urban areas, which is also important in terms of climate migration, is increasing. And the built environment's responsible for around 40% of our emissions, with 10% from embodied carbon. And a lot of that urban area emissions comes from poorly built, poorly designed, inadequately insulated, and energy inefficient buildings. In the district, about half of our emissions come from residential buildings. So, if we're going to have a resilient urban future, we really need to not only start retrofitting the buildings we have now, but also only building new buildings which are focused on net zero. I think the other thing that's important to talk about is that this is also an equity issue. So, carbon emissions are associated with energy use, and in 2020, before the energy crisis, 15.1% of households in Lancaster district were living in energy poverty, and this number is expected to be about double that today. And the other thing is that energy poverty and homes and loss of bad energy use really impacts our vulnerable communities, our low-income families, single-parent households, elderly, people of color. So the question is, what if we could have homes that didn't need um, so much energy to heat, or didn't need heating at all? Or what if they were designed to produce their own energy? We do have the technology and know-how to do this today. So where does the local plan fit in? The National Planning Policy Framework sets out that the planning system should shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Local authorities can set their own renewable energy standards and are starting to set their own energy efficiency standards, as is being seen in Cornwall and a few other councils. There's not many other councils, though, who've taken this option. That's because the planning system is broadly in favor of sticking with national targets. If you look at this graph, the bright blue on that is national government's attempt at decreasing energy use in buildings. You'll see that the government's focus is on making homes zero carbon ready, or homes that will decarbonize if and when the grid decarbonizes. But these homes still use a lot of energy to live comfortably in. We're really focused on maximizing those co-benefits. So we developed a policy based on passive house principles, which reduce that energy use in the home, which is that bright green on the graph. And if you stick solar onto this house, that house is actually energy positive, or it's making more energy than the household would uses. These are homes that are truly carbon zero, regardless if the grid decarbonizes. The other area we're really looking at is flooding. With each increment of warning, those losses and damages associated with climate disasters increases. These pictures are from 2015. Every single building in Lancaster in this flood was impacted, whether by flooding, loss of power, or loss of access. The flood that's in this picture here was seen as unprecedented, yet another unprecedented flood happened 2 years later in 2017. So we started looking at our flooding policies a bit more, and looked at the risk from seas, rivers, surface and groundwater, and sewage, and made policies to address all forms of flooding and reduce flood risk where opportunities exist. Quite critically, also, we focused on decreasing impermeable areas, prioritizing nature based solutions. And this is because when we deliver nature based solutions, this provides spaces, green spaces for people, increases biodiversity, creates these multifunctional spaces, which can be used for lots of things, which again focus on maximizing those co benefits and public good of climate action. I think one of the things that local authorities can sometimes is challenging is that skills and capacity building. So we've done a lot of work on increasing that. We've done a lot of work with the university, and have a stronger research focus as part of our evidence-based development. And the other thing is we need to include diverse voices in the plan making process. We've got a strong focus on collaboration with communities now, and we've changed the way that we're doing engagement. So it's longer term, going to people where they're at. And we've also got a work stream that's focused just on young people. I think this is particularly important because we're delivering policies today for places that they will need to live in and inherit. This isn't always easy. As a local authority, we pride ourselves on the work we've done. We were recently ranked the highest scoring district council in the UK for climate action and the fifth highest overall on our work on climate priorities. I think one of the things that's important to say, though, is right now in the national landscape in the UK, what local authorities accomplish on climate action is really in despite of national government and not because of it. Um, our policy for low energy homes is currently stuck at the post hearing stage. The inspector doesn't feel that ours as a local authority should be able to set our own energy efficiency standards, even though other local authorities are. She's based her stance on a written ministerial statement from 8 years ago, which in our view, the view of the Town and Country Planning Association and the Royal Town and Planning Institute, as well as progress in law events and new policy over the last 8 years, is no longer relevant. So we have been across the country at events and conferences talking about this issue. We've had meetings with the Department of Leveling Up. We're involved with the press. And last week, as was mentioned, we were featured on Channel 4 in the documentary series The Big Climate Fight, where Kevin McLeod focused on this very issue in Lancaster. We've also had repeated letters back and forth with the inspector, strong community engagement, 500 plus complaints against the inspector's decision, and we have yet to receive an answer on where this is going to be going and if our new homes in our district will be built for people and planet. So we need policies to meet the challenges of the climate emergency, and it's not something we can do alone or in our silos. I think we're going to be talking later about how we can work together in partnership to deliver things. Um, and it's also really a time for transdisciplinary working. We've got to act creatively, and we need to really include our communities and act cross sector if we're going to meet these challenges. So that's me. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Susanna. I can see you're getting a lot of little emoji applause there. That was really, really interesting. I think that closing note of "we can't do it alone" is something that we definitely will return to in discussion and Q&A. Before we go to that, though, let's hear from Catherine. So welcome, Catherine, to the virtual Festival of Place Climate Resilience stage. We're really happy to have you dialing in all the way from Washington, D.C. to be our international representative. And I'll just do a brief introduction to Catherine while she gets her slides up. So Catherine's an urban planner, climate resilience specialist, and smart growth advocate with 15 years of experience working in the US, the UK, and Germany, and a number of global projects as well in master planning research, land use design, project management, and urban design charrettes and post-disaster recovery. So she's done a bit of everything in this space. She's currently vice president of land use and development at Smart Growth America, where she oversees their land use programs. And prior to that, she led the urban resilience program at the Urban Land Institute. Catherine, I will hand over to you now to take us through your presentation.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Christine and the whole team for the invitation to Festival of Place today. I'm really thrilled to be here and to participate in this discussion with an opportunity for lessons learned and connectivity between the US and UK. And as Christine mentioned, I'm a past expat. I lived and worked in London from 2007 to 2012. And having had the opportunity to learn from the British approach to land use policy has really informed my advocacy work now. So to quickly introduce my organization and perspective before I jump into the presentation, I'm with Smart Growth America, and we're a US-based advocacy organization which is seeking to promote sustainable and equitable development with a special focus on better connectivity between land use and transportation policy. And we envision a country where no matter who you are or where you live, you can enjoy living in a place that's healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And I think looking at the program that Festival of Place has put on over the past 2 days, we can all agree that a key part of a healthy, prosperous, and resilient place is preparedness for the climate emergency, whether that is considering extreme heat, flooding, or the many other climate hazards, which can be incredibly detrimental to health, to structural safety, and to quality of life. So at Smart Growth America, we're passionate about built environment, as I think many of the attendees of Festival of Place are, and we really see connected land use policy as a critical strategy to address some of the key priorities of our time, including both mitigating and adapting to climate change, advancing racial equity, especially considering that in the US, many land use policies are based on racist intent, and it's critical to dismantle these. My apologies, I'm in an office where the light is always turning off. We also see the built environment as a key way to improve community health, especially as you look at walkability, access to green space, civic resources. But of course, health also has a key connectivity to climate and climate resilience. So today, my intention with this presentation is to give you a quick overview of the policy landscape in the US right now and the kind of key connectivity points with the trends that you're seeing in the UK. I'm also including a lot of resources, which I'll share with Christine afterwards in the event that folks are interested in digging in deeper to specific research opportunities. So first, where are we? I think summer 2023 in the US was a bit of a reckoning in that we saw some of the most intense climate events of all kinds in all corners of this very large country. And it was really terrifying. And, it was frankly, a terrible time. First is the hottest summer on record. And I think we'll continue to see hot summers like this. We had drought events in the Southwest, the worst wildfire event in over 100 years in a location which very few people associate with wildfire, the beautiful lush site in Hawaii. Also, wildfire events in Canada led to smoke and, days of air quality alerts in the New York, DC, and both West Coast and East Coast areas. And then finally, floods in the Northeast. And our organization's based in DC, and I'm there right now, but I actually live up in Montpelier, Vermont. And working in climate resilience, I have a lot of awareness of the fact that we will continue to experience increasingly intense and frequent events, but hadn't anticipated personally experiencing one myself this summer. So this is the downtown where I live. There was, similar to what we heard about from Susanna, something that's been described as a once-in-a-generation flood event, but these events are, of course, becoming more and more frequent. So, here's a shot from my afternoon of volunteer work cleaning out the chairs of the movie theater. So while there is this increased awareness of the extent of the climate emergency, I think we're at an exciting place from a federal perspective in that there are historic levels of federal funding available to address the climate crisis. And I appreciate Susanna's comment on how progress is often made in spite of a federal framework, not because of it. I think in the US at this point, we are at a moment where there is a lot of federal funding and a strong commitment to addressing the climate crisis. But this is it can be a short period of time with potential for political pendulum swings. And so there's a lot of focus from advocates and others to use this funding to make significant progress. I hope it's not only a while we can situation, but you always have to be prepared for that. Finally, while I think there is there has been a lot of great progress in the design, development, and planning communities on best practices for climate resilience planning and policy, there is still significant gaps between known best practices and what's built. So I'll walk through a few key areas that I see as top priority and share, where we are, opportunities for growth and future directions. So first, similar to the UK, the US is currently addressing an incredible housing access crisis. Housing prices have skyrocketed since the pandemic, and supply is so far from keeping up. It is incredibly difficult for low and moderate income households to find a place to live, let alone a place which is in relatively close proximity to places of work. And of course, there's so much connectivity between this housing crisis and the need to drive further, therefore creating further emissions, which are contributing to the climate crisis. So we're in a housing access crisis where housing advocates are making incredible strides with the YIMBY movement, that's the Yes in My Backyard movement, to build more much needed housing. But frankly, right now, it's difficult to build housing anywhere, let alone to build the kind of housing that we need to be more prepared for future climate events. And so that is a lot of what my organization's work is all about, seeking to advocate for policy change to produce more housing near transportation, in locations which are well accessible to services and civic amenities, and in locations which are less susceptible to climate impacts. Right now, we're also seeing a lot of the growth, and again, this is much needed growth, happening in locations which face the most climate risk. This can be the climate risk of flooding, sea level rise, especially in coastal communities like Florida or the Carolinas, risk of drought and extreme heat in the Southwest. In much of the US, the locations with the most lax land use and housing policies, where it's the easiest to build, are unfortunately at higher risk, and also may and so, excuse me, here we have some stats from Redfin looking at how what they call climate endangered areas are becoming more and more populous, looking by hazard. The census has also started to track this, and as you can see, we're seeing a lot of growth in the Southwest, Texas, Arizona, Florida. So again, these are locations where households might, over the short and longer term, be more susceptible to climate hazards. We also saw these trends during the pandemic, where trends converged between the rise of remote work, interest in parks and open spaces, and ability to move. And many areas, especially Florida, got a lot of migration during the pandemic. I appreciate that Susanna also started off with sort of her story of previous days and where she grew up before coming to the UK. Right now, we are seeing incredible building in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, with some housing which is already permitted, already being anticipated to not have sufficient groundwater. So again, this really isn't an in the future issue. The housing which is being built right now is already at severe risk of not being able to access basic services. A key focus for our organization as well is climate risk and the inherent inequities. Racist land use and development policy, especially in the US, where redlining led communities of color to face cycles of disinvestment, have led to disparate economic outcomes today. This image here shows a community called Ile de Jean Charles. This is a coastal community in Louisiana, which an indigenous community was essentially forced to move to a location which, as you can see, is at severe risk of sea level rise and coastal flooding. This was on account of the Indian Removal Act. Erosion, flooding, and subsidence have essentially made the community nearly unlivable. And over the past decade, the tribe has partnered with the state to win a grant for resettlement to the north. This is one of the first examples of a state-funded managed retreat in the US. And I think the work remains ongoing, and it's a real example of the inequities and the political dynamics here, and the extent of risk that can be faced by communities historically marginalized by land use policy. In urban settings, we also see that communities which were formerly redlined are both subject to more of the urban heat island effect and to more flood risk. And we've seen in the US studies of this in Richmond, Virginia, Portland, Oregon, and a number of other different communities. We also see, and looking at statistics from the Trust for Public Land, which is a parks and open space advocacy organization, significant differences in terms of the amount of open space and amenities and civic investment in locations where home to communities of color. And I think, as everyone recognized, parks are a really critical part of preparing for climate events, and offer that opportunity to both create a civic space and a space which can reduce urban heat island and prepare for flooding. So again, these investments are critical, and the historically discriminatory land use policy has really compounded the risks of climate change. Finally, I'll share a look forward into some future issues that we're starting to face in US planning policy, and I think will take a lot of partnerships and creative thinking to start to address. So I think the next frontier, which we're starting to see in a country as large as the US, is migration. Migration is well documented after major climate events such as Hurricane Katrina, saw people relocating from Louisiana to Houston, Atlanta. More recently, we have seen large communities from Puerto Rico relocate to Florida and New York after hurricane damages. But as we move into a future with increasingly harmful climate impacts from extreme heat, from everyday sunny day flooding, as well as storm events, it's easy to anticipate that more and more moves will be motivated by fear of climate impacts. And so we're starting to see studies looking at what migration driven by heat could look like. I recommend looking at ProPublica, which is an excellent investigative journalism resource, which has looked at this in the past couple of years. Interestingly, the White House has even done some look at what the equity impacts would be from climate change migration, and the National League of Cities, which is a local government advocacy organization based here in DC. So this is no longer an issue of interest to climate scientists. Local governments are starting to think about migration, both from a regional perspective and from within a city perspective, looking at the risk of climate gentrification, where lower income communities are priced out of sites which are relatively lower risk, such as we're seeing in Little Haiti in the Miami area. Meanwhile, we're also starting to see some locations advertise themselves from an economic development perspective as climate havens. So in the US, a few which are often cited are Buffalo, New York, Cincinnati, the Great Lakes region. I think we have yet to see whether there is actually a proactive movement which leads to economic development opportunity. But this is, it's something which local governments are seizing on to try to recruit local businesses. I'll observe that as we started off with the housing access crisis, many of these locations remain sites where it's very difficult to build new housing, and especially new infill housing or housing near transportation or in downtown walkable settings. So I hope that many of these communities which are trying to poise themselves to welcome new community members are also preparing to build more housing that would be prepared for the risks that they face. And Redfin, looking at an individual level, is starting to see this trend amongst home buyers, as they're looking at, typically these are affluent or upwardly mobile home buyers who have, more of a choice in terms of what location they might pursue. They're increasingly beginning to cite climate as one of the key factors. And again, where I live in Vermont, I often do meet people who cite, I couldn't handle another wildfire season as one of their reasons to choose to come to New England. And with that, I'm really excited to turn it back to Elizabeth and Susanna to have a little bit of a discussion. I found it really inspiring to learn about Susanna's work integrating climate goals into the local planning process. I'm excited to share more of what we're seeing at this moment in the US now, where the Biden administration has made a large-scale investment. Just last week, there was an announcement of $2 billion of grants going directly to community-based organizations, which is being trumpeted as the largest environmental justice investment of all time from the federal government. So there's, I think, exciting things going on, as well as areas where we have a lot of work to do. So eager to turn it back over to the group and to hear from the audience. Thank you again for hosting today.
Thanks, Catherine. And don't forget to move around so that light doesn't go off again. We've all been there. Thank you so much, Catherine and Susanna. So much to dig into there. I'm going to start us off with a couple of questions, and then I think we discussed that you two might have some questions for each other. So we'll get into that. But then, meantime, audience members, please do use that Q&A function to come in with your own questions. We will be leaving plenty of time to answer audience questions, and feel free to use the upvote function if somebody else posts a chat question that you're particularly interested in hearing the panel discuss. I'll kick us off. So, Catherine, Susanna, your presentations got me thinking about so many things, but the one thing that I noted down while you were talking was that policy can be an enabler or a blocker, and sometimes both. And sometimes policies that you wouldn't even think would be involved, such as a written ministerial statement from 8 years ago, or historic policies on land use in the United States, end up being enablers, blockers. So I think either way, we've got a lot of practitioners in the audience today who know that policy plays a role, but they also want to be out doing things, taking action, and helping as well. And as Susanna said, none of us can do this alone. So with that in mind, my first question to you two is how everyone out there who's a practitioner working in this space can best make the argument to decision makers and to the public for making climate resilience a core part of urban planning and policy. And if you've got any tips on what types of arguments or approaches to the conversation are most impactful in convincing people, because we all know these conversations can be really difficult sometimes. People have a lot of different type of vested interests, preconceptions, concerns. So any tips and tactics that you've used that help sort of engage people and bring them into the conversation in a productive way to drive change would be very welcome. Who wants to start? Susanna, should we start with you?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to do that. So I think one of the things I want to just think that, I want to pick up the second one before I go into the first one, is like, how do we communicate why this is so important? And I think climate change is pretty abstract. And even when we're in the middle of a disaster, there's a disaster, but it's not, we feel it acutely, but we don't feel that chronic thing. And people are really bad at long-term planning. So I think one of the things we're really focusing on is that co-benefit side. So for people, what are kind of those, we've developed with our young people a sustainable placemaking framework. It's based on those things that they'd like to see in their cities and what makes it sustainable. And we have conversations about what sustainable cities look like. And then we build policies off the things people want to see. Things like walkable neighborhoods. They want to see that. But that also benefits the climate, right? That we get mitigation and adaptation as part of that. They want to see lower energy bills. Great. We get climate adaptation and mitigation and resilience as part of that. Um, and I think too, then when we're working with our developers and we're working with our housing providers, it's also on like, so for example, when we're working with our registered providers around affordable and social housing delivery, building to higher fabric standards actually decreases the amount of rental arrears. So it provides, that may be a bit of a cost uplift in delivering that initially, but you reduce those rental arrears over time. And actually that leads to better tenants, that leads to better, um, more stable business cases. And then with our developers, green properties sell with a price uplift. So it's worth developing with better energy efficiency. Um, and I think too, if we're looking at if we don't, the US is particularly a good example of this, but you don't want to be developing where it's going to continue to flood, or where there's going to be continued issues with access because of flooding, or there's a wildfire risk. So it's really about communicating those wider benefits, and that actually climate action is a really positive thing, and it's a really good thing.
Yeah, that wider benefit thing is something I really agree with. We have flooding in my neighborhood, and I'm part of a local flood action group, and trying to get people to focus on it apart from the immediate aftermath of event through the language of climate change is really difficult. But if, the council's had a lot of success in just going around saying, would you like a water butt? It'll help you, have water to water your garden during those dry summers. And everybody says, yes, please.
Yeah,
It's sometimes about that simple framing. Catherine, would you like to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Susanna, you started with the positive around the co-benefits. So I'll take the other tact, which is talking about the costs, and especially working in the built environment. The hope is that, you all are dialing in from the UK, whereas I'm from the US. So we have a different perspective here. But at the bare minimum, you'd hope that a useful life of a building would be at least 50 years. And to think that right now, in many parts of the US, building codes, FEMA, which is our emergency management agency, is still using data from the past. So buildings are being built to standards where they're really not prepared for what the future holds, whether we're talking about location or we're talking about actual building design issues. And so, I found the cost argument is really a key one that leads to changes in decision making. That being said, I think we also see, different business models from the development community versus the local government, especially in the US, where you have many high risk areas that are quite lucrative from a real estate development perspective. If there is, for some types of developers that really only have a short-term interest, the climate risk is not a problem. And so that's what motivated me to move into advocacy. I really think there has to be policy change to lead to that market change, and looking at the lower cost of investment in preparedness versus loss after an extreme event. I think that's very well documented. I'll pull it back around though to something positive. We just had Thanksgiving in the US last year, where you might get together with your aunt or uncle who don't think climate change is real. I really recommend a climate scientist who I'll always appreciate, because she spells her name the same way as me, Katharine Hayhoe. She has a great email list where she sends regular newsletters on how to be a climate communicator and how to talk to the people in your life who might not be naturally interested in engaging on this topic. And one of her main messages is always to start with your own life, start with what's relevant to you. As opposed to starting with the extent of the crisis. So I recommend checking out her information as you're thinking about advocacy at a more interpersonal level.
Thanks. Catherine Hayhoe, how do you spell the surname?
I'll add it in the chat.
Ah, perfect. Thank you, because I'm writing that down, but probably spelling it wrong, although I do have the first name correct, thanks to you. Thanks both. Another question I had, that you got me thinking about, Catherine, with the end of your presentation, were some of the difficult decisions that we're going to be having to make probably sooner, certainly, than I had realized as someone working in this space, about climate migration, managed retreat, stranded assets, the really kind of hard-nosed end of this. Is this an issue that should be left for policymakers, or do we have a responsibility as practitioners to be bringing this into our work? And if so, the question then for me is, how on earth do we do this, given what we've just been talking about, how even some of the very simple elements of trying to deal with climate resilience are sometimes difficult to have a conversation around? How do we get into that difficult stuff, or is it something that is just left for policy?
I can start.
Yeah, thanks.
This is an issue we're really thinking about, especially since it plays out in different ways in different parts of the country. I think it's always going to be an inherently emotional issue. And what brought me into working in this space was working post-Katrina, where was meeting families that had lost everything and that were living in a community that is so vibrant, so culturally unique. To move would be a lot more than just a relocation. It's a real cultural loss. So it's, I think, always going to be a very difficult issue. I think a way to start is to try to support the development of more housing, vibrant places, and especially more affordable units in locations which are less prone to climate hazards. So start with building up more and increasing supply in locations which are less likely to face risk. And then that might help the kind of longer term evolution happen. In the US, we have often sort of floodplain buyouts can be funded by the federal or state government. And it's very rare that, or I'll step back here. I think from my perspective, it's problematic for a household to really be forced to move. It's important that there is an element of, an opportunity to make the decision that's right for your household, and also the opportunity to stay within your social network. I think a real opportunity for improvement in the US is many of these programs offer funding to move, but then they don't offer any sort of support to identify a new location. And so often, this funding is going to households that then end up in another location, which is actually also at risk because that's the only affordable units that are available in the region where the individual works. So again, I think there's just really a need for a more joined up approach, and it's going to take everyone. And I think a role of practitioners, depending on what your type of role you play, is to make your team, your colleagues aware of the issues. If you're working on a project in a site that faces vulnerabilities, bring that up in the design process, as well as in your efforts as an advocate looking at policy change.
Yeah.
Thanks. And you got me thinking about, Susanna, your climate local plan review, and it'd be great to hear more from you on this, and also maybe looping in the question that Christine's put in the chat about what policy do we need for the UK specifically. So any insight you have around that would be really welcome.
I mean, I think it's a really good question, because policy lags. There's serious policy lags and also policy changes. I recognize there is a need for example, in the UK, better policy making around electrical grid provision, or there's better national policy. We've got a question that's going to come up in the chat around what we do around coastal communities that are losing land. We're missing policy, and policy is lagging. We're in Lancaster. We prepared our local plan in record time ahead of every other local authority in the UK, but we're stuck, and we've been stuck now for over a year. So I think what's quite important as practitioners and in our other areas of work, that like Catherine was saying, we say, okay, we need to educate ourselves on where those risk areas are, and not rely on policy to take the lead always, but be aware of your development site, and if there's those risks that are there, and to develop your development in a way that is climate resilient, and seek out development sites which are climate resilient, and understand those local areas. I think that's quite important. So that, in the projects that we do, we challenge our design thinking by using that climate framework.
Thank you. And do you think we're going to be getting into these compensation conversations more often that Catherine talked about is starting to happen albeit not very often in the US.
Well, I mean, I think it happens way more in the US than in the UK. I think
Yeah.
it's been very different working for a local authority in the UK. I think we're closely watching, for example, we're losing communities right now to the sea, and we're losing communities to areas where shoreline management plans are no longer holding the line. And this has devastating impacts on people. And I think, Catherine, you mentioned the floodplain buyouts in the US, and other programs like where we compensate people in the US when national disasters are too great for those areas. We don't see that kind of compensation happening like that in the UK. So yes, it's totally, there's those things missing, like support for identifying new location. So you were talking about, Catherine, so people may buy their new home then in an area that's just at risk. But in the UK, that's just missing. We tend to give people notice that their home is in an area where we're no longer holding the line or where they're at risk of coastal erosion, and that's it. And that needs to be challenged, and we need to do things around that. The EA and DEFRA are working on their Coastal Transition Acceleration Program, and we're closely watching what's happening in North Norfolk. They've got a policy that's just gone to consultation, which is policy CC5 and CC6. CC5 really limits the places in which you can put development with a 100-year horizon. And then policy CC6 is quite interesting in terms of what Catherine was talking about, because what that allows for is the movement or the moving of relocation and replacement of community facilities, businesses, and homes, but into areas which are deemed as not to be at risk for a minimum of 50 years. And so I think that's kind of that strategic policy and planning that needs to be in place, but that financial compensation is really missing.
Yeah.
Catherine,
I've got to jump in with a quick, I'm feeling the US UK connectivity because I'm going to share an example from Norfolk, Virginia, where
such a good one.
You don't often see in the US zoning makes the decisions on land use at the local level. And Norfolk is one of the only cities in the US which has integrated climate resilience into zoning writ large and has used zoning as a strategy to direct development to sites which face less future hazards. Our team did a sort of fiscal impact study of the zoning, which admittedly had a lot of other things to consider when you take into account that it was implemented just before the pandemic. So market's been a little bit funky, but we were excited to see that having taken this more proactive approach from a policy perspective, there's often fear from the real estate community, from the realtor communities, from homeowners that this kind of messaging will lead to reduced home value when there's a clearer policy directive to reduce development in certain locations. And actually, in the period since the zoning change happened in this city, there wasn't any real estate market impact. So we actually saw this as a positive. I think over the long term, market impact is what will lead to change. But in the short term, it is good to see that it was possible to make a kind of proactive policy decision and look at Stark in here again without a big financial problem for community members.
I'm glad your office has good energy saving lighting methods, Catherine. Always
trying to contribute, yeah.
I think we've actually only got about 6 minutes left before we wrap up, and there's so many more questions to ask. I do want to come to the Q&A, and what I'm going to try and do is slightly clumsily wrap together a couple of the questions that we've got. So we've got a question from Claire Daly and a question from Joseph Baines in the Q&A. And what they both made me think about actually is the conversation we've been having about different types of policy interventions. And the thing that always happens when you talk about policy, which is you get into carrots and you get into sticks, right? And that you always need a bit of a combination. So you need to talk about the co-benefits. And with that in mind, Claire's question about, how do we plan housing developments that actually bring all these co-benefits that just by default help us be more climate resilient because they're less car dependent and have more green livable spaces. Sort of how do we make sure that's happening? And then I think, Joseph's question about, yes, we know there's education and awareness. What else can we do to persuade and convince reluctant local communities to adapt? And I don't know exactly what Joseph's getting at, but it does make me think about, when all of the positive rhetoric and incentives aren't working, what else is there? And do you have to go more to sticks, like, having zoning restrictions and more sort of specific rules? That was a very clumsy question. I apologize. I think the question in there, if I could be a little bit more precise, I guess, is, is it about a balance? Is it about kind of trading off, or are there other methods that we haven't talked about, either on the incentive side or on the sort of slightly more enforcing side, that can help us move faster, because we know that we need to in this space?
I'll add one topic which hasn't come up, which I sense is near and dear to the Festival of Place community, which is partnerships. And I think in the US, we're seeking to identify more strategies where the real estate community could be a key part of delivering much needed climate infrastructure, which will then, create more value and then enable a larger scale development to happen. We use something called TIF, which is a tax increment finance. Thinking about how to leverage that for climate adaptation is an area that I'm personally interested in. But I think in this conversation, we've spoken a lot about the dynamics with climate risk and the real estate development community. And I think it's going to be a key part of the solution.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. One of the things we're really focusing on is how we can do those kind of have strategic partnerships in our district, where we're currently working with a lot of our different organizations which have assets in the area on how we can develop a shared framework for using our assets and understanding what strategic projects and priorities we want to do around climate. And I think it's really important, like one industry isn't going to, we all rely on each other for everything. And I think coming together is a way that we can have much more productive things happen. Exeter is a really interesting example of that with their Exeter City Futures program. The other thing I wanted to pick up on is that we've had quite a lot of success in co-designing things with people. So using that, instead of having a very policy community, policy developer, policy elected official interaction, it's more of a side by side, let's see how we can work together on this and make sure that the policies that we're putting in place are really designed for those different interests and different views, but are also taking into account what we need to develop and where we need to develop in terms of the climate crisis.
Thank you. So we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to try and be a good chair and finish this up on time. So I think that leaves us just time for any last words of advice. And I suppose if there's anything else, like partnerships that you brought in, Catherine, if there's anything else that we haven't mentioned yet today, this is maybe your speak now or forever hold your peace, including maybe if you want to just launch in a couple of controversial bombs that you want the audience to take away and think about, go for it. Who wants to go first?
Do you want to go first, Catherine? All right,
she got the short straw.
Yeah, Susanna, you start us off with the bomb around your climate action happening not in despite of the national government rather than because of it. I think we're facing, such a climate emergency, which will really take long-term effort and partnership, and where the efforts will need to endure despite changes in political priorities, both at the national level and then in the US. We look also at the ability to keep things moving at the state or local level if the national government is unsupportive. So I think it's really fantastic that this group of practitioners is coming together to think about what you can do in your practice outside of policy. And I hope we leave this session both thinking about how to advance policy in the communities where you live and work as an advocate and in your role as a designer or developer.
Yeah, I think my bomb would be we have insufficient funding, insufficient policy, and a lack of action and a total amount of inertia in every every system that we've got, economic system, policy system, to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. And I think a lot of the work that's gone into that last IPCC report, and the COP28 reports just really highlight how desperately far behind we are. So I would challenge us to just act today. Don't wait, figure it out, understand this is real, and that we're on track for a 2.5 to 2.9 degree world. And we need to have systems change, and we need to do that together. And I think I think we can make a really good livable world for us, but we need to have that like positivity and really work with each other and work with communities to deliver that. It's a good challenge. And I think we're up to it.
Well, thank you, Catherine, Susanna, and Christine is back with us, I think, to close out
that just
our
leaves
conference.
me.
So welcome back, Christine, and thank you so much, Catherine, Susanna, and everyone for engaging.
Thank you. Beautifully
Thank you.
chaired, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Catherine and Susanna. So much food for thought there, and actually really challenging conversations about these ideas of managed retreat, and these feels like really difficult conversations, really really emotive conversations, and I really appreciate you guys grappling with the complexity and the challenge at hand and encouraging action. This is actually our last session. So I want to thank all of our speakers, actually, not just this brilliant panel, and all of the audience for your questions. Civic engineers, thank you so much for being our proud supporter of this event. Thank you to our members for supporting us. Our next event is Festival of Place Social Impact, which will be taking place in February, looking at how we can make a social contribution through our work, the S in the ESG. Don't forget that the Pineapple is always here to remind you, our Pineapples Awards are open for entries right now. We have categories from Creative Retrofit Place of the Year to kind of celebrate those of you who are making great places out there. If you love this content, you'll love the developer and our live event, Festival of Place in the summer. So do keep in touch with us about that. And thank you so much to the team behind the scenes who are making this all happen. Our producer, Simon Mercer, my co-founder, James McLeod, Bethany and Yusta, who are out there fielding questions and technical issues and doing lots of hard legwork behind the scenes. So that's it from us. Please let us know what you thought of the event. Thank you for your participation. And that's all for now. Of course, everything is recorded. So if you want to watch back, it's all available now. Just click on the schedule button. That's it.